From Cruelty to Goodness by Philip Hallie. I am a student of ethics, of good and evil, but my approach to these two rather melodramatic terms is skeptical. I am in the tradition of the ancient Greek skeptikoi, whose name means inquirers or investigators. And what we investigate is relationships among particular facts. What we put into doubt are the intricate webs of high-level abstractions that pass for philosophizing in the ancient world, and that still pass for philosophizing. My approach to good and evil emphasizes not abstract common nouns like justice, but proper names and verbs. Names and verbs keep us close to the facts better than do our highfalutin common nouns. Names refer to particular people, and verbs connect subjects with predicates in time, while common nouns are above all this. One of the words that is important to me is my own name. For me, philosophy is personal. It is closer to literature and history than it is to the exact sciences, closer to the passions, actions, and common sense of individual persons than to a dispassionate technical science. It has to do with the personal matter of wisdom, and so ethics for me is personal, my story, and not necessarily, though possibly, yours. It concerns particular people at particular times. But ethics is more than such particulars. It involves abstractions, that is, rules, laws, ideals. When you look at the ethical magnates of history, you see in their words and deeds two sorts of ethical rules, negative and positive. The negative rules are scattered throughout the Bible, but Moses brought down from Mount Sinai the main negative ethical rules of the West. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not betray. The positive injunctions are similarly spread throughout the Bible. In the first chapter of the book of Isaiah, we are told to defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. The negative ethic forbids certain actions. The positive ethic demands certain actions. To follow the negative ethic is to be decent, to have clean hands. But to follow the positive ethic, to be one's brother's keeper, is to be more than decent. It is to be active, even aggressive. If the negative ethic is one of decency, the positive one is the ethic of riskful, strenuous nobility. In my early studies of particularized ethical terms, I found myself dwelling upon negative ethics, upon prohibitions. And among the most conspicuous prohibitions I found embodied in history was the prohibition against deliberate harm-doing, against cruelty. Thou shalt not be cruel had as much to do with the nightmare of history as did the prohibitions against murder and betrayal. In fact, many of the 10 Commandments, especially those against murder, adultery, stealing, and betrayal, were ways of prohibiting cruelty. Early in my research, it became clear that there are various approaches to cruelty, as the different commandments suggest. For instance, there is the way reflected in the origins of the word cruel. The Latin crudus is related to still older words standing for bloodshed or raw flesh. According to the etymology of the word, cruelty involves the spilling of blood. But modern dictionaries give the word a different meaning. They define it as disposed to giving pain. They emphasize awareness, not simply bloodshed. After all, they seem to say, you cannot be cruel to a dead body. There is no cruelty without consciousness. And so I found myself studying the kinds of awareness associated with the hurting of human beings. It is certainly true that for millennia in history and literature, people have been torturing each other not only with hard weapons, but also with hard words. Still, the word pain seems to be a simplistic and superficial way of describing the many different sorts of cruelty. In Resca Weiss's Journey Through Hell, London, 1961, there is a brief passage of one of the deepest cruelties that Nazis perpetrated upon extermination camp inmates on a march. Urine and excreta poured down the prisoners' legs, and by nightfall the excrement, which had frozen to our limbs, gave off its stench. And Weiss goes on to talk not in terms of pain or bloodshed, but in other terms. We were really no longer human beings in the accepted sense, not even animals, but putrefying corpses moving on two legs. There is one factor that the idea of pain and the simpler idea of bloodshed do not touch. Cruelty, not playful, quotidian teasing or ragging, but cruelty, what the anti-cruelty societies usually call substantial cruelty, involves the maiming of a person's dignity, the crushing of a person's self-respect. Bloodshed, the idea of pain, which is usually something involving a localizable occurrence, localizable in a tooth, in a head, in short, in the body. These are superficial ideas of cruelty. A whip, bleeding flesh. These are what the journalists of cruelty emphasize, following the etymology and dictionary meaning of the word. But the depths of an understanding of cruelty lie in the depths of an understanding of human dignity, and of how you can maim it without bloodshed, and often without localizable bodily pain. In excremental assault, in the process of keeping camp inmates from wiping themselves, or from going to the latrine, and in making them drink water from a toilet bowl full of excreta, and the excreta of the guards at that, localizable pain is nothing. Deep humiliation is everything. We human beings believe in hierarchies, whether we are skeptics or not about human value. There is a hierarchical gap between shit and me. We are even above using the word. We are above walking around besmirched with feces. Our dignity, whatever the origins of that dignity may be, does not permit it. In order to be able to want to live, in order to be able to walk erect, we must respect ourselves as beings higher than our feces. When we feel that we are not higher than dirt or filth, then our lives are maimed at the very center, in the very depths, not merely in some localizable portion of our bodies. And when our lives are so maimed, we become things, slaves, instruments. From ancient times until this moment, and as long as there will be human beings on this planet, there are those who know this and will use it. Just as the Roman slave owners and the South American slave owners knew it when, one time a year, they encouraged the slaves to drink all the alcohol they could drink, so that they could get bestially drunk and even more bestially sick afterwards, under the eyes of their generous owners. The self-hatred, the loss of self-respect that the Saturnalia created in ancient Rome, say, made it possible to continue using the slaves as things, since they themselves came to think of themselves as things, as subhuman tools of the owners and the overseers. Institutionalized cruelty, I learned, is the subtlest kind of cruelty. In episodic cruelty, the victim knows he is being hurt, and his victimizer knows it too. But in a persistent pattern of humiliation that endures for years in the community, both the victim and the victimizer find ways of obscuring the harm that is being done. Blacks come to think of themselves as inferior, even aesthetically inferior. Black is dirty. And Jews come to think of themselves as inferior, even aesthetically. Dark hair and aquiline noses are ugly. So that the way they are being treated is justified by their actual inferiority, by the inferiority they themselves feel. A similar process happens in the minds of the victimizers in institutionalized cruelty. They feel that since they are superior, even aesthetically, to be blonde is to be beautiful, they deserve to do what they wish, deserve to have these lower creatures under their control. The words of Heinrich Himmler, head of the Nazi SS, in Posen in the year 1943 in a speech to his SS subordinates in a closed session show how institutionalized cruelty can obscure harm-doing. The words come so easily. The Jewish people will be exterminated, says every party member. Of course, it is in our program, extermination. We will take care of it. And then they come, these nice 80 million Germans, and every one of them has his decent Jew. Sure, the others are swine, but his one is a fine Jew. Most of you will know what it means to have seen 100 corpses together, or 500, or 1,000. To have made one's way through that, and to have remained a decent person throughout. And that is what has made us hard. That is a page of glory in our history. In this speech, he was making a sharp distinction between the program of crushing the Jews and the personal sentiments of individual Germans. The program stretched over years. Personal sentiments were momentary. He was pleading for the program, for institutionalized destruction. But one of the most interesting parts of the speech occurs towards the end of it. In sum, we can say that we fulfilled this heaviest of tasks, destroying the Jews, in love to our people, and we suffered no harm in our essence, in our soul, in our character. Commitment that overrides all sentimentality transforms cruelty and destruction into moral nobility. And commitment is the lifeblood of an institution. Cruelty and the power relationships. But when I studied all these ways that we have used the word cruelty, I was nagged by the feeling that I had not penetrated into its inner structure. I was classifying, sorting out symptoms, but symptoms are signals. And what were these symptoms signal of? I felt like a person who had been studying cancer by sorting out brief pains from persistent pains, pains in the belly from pains in the head. I was being superficial, and I was not asking the question, what are the forces behind these kinds of cruelty? I felt that there were such forces, but as yet I had not touched them. Then one day, I was reading in one of the great autobiographies of Western civilization, Frederick Douglass's Life and Times. The passage I was reading was about Douglass's thoughts on the origins of slavery. He was asking himself, how could these whites keep us enslaved? And he suddenly realized, my faculties and powers of body and soul are not my own, but are the property of a fellow mortal in no sense superior to me, except that he has the physical power to compel me to be owned and controlled by him. By the combined physical force of the community, I am his slave, a slave for life. And then I saw that a disparity in power lay at the center of the dynamism of cruelty. If it was institutional cruelty, it was in all likelihood a difference involving both verbal and physical power that kept the cruelty going. The power of the majority and the weakness of a minority were at the center of the institutional cruelty of slavery and of Nazi anti-Semitism. The whites not only outnumbered the blacks in America, but had economic and political ascendancy over them. But just as important as these physical powers was the power that the word like the N-word and slave gave the white majority. Their language sanctified if it did not create their power ascendancy over the blacks. And one of the most important projects of the slaveholders and their allies was that of seeing to it that the blacks themselves thought of themselves in just these powerless terms. They utilized the language to convince not only the whites, but the blacks themselves that blacks were weak in mind, in willpower, and in worth. These words were like the excremental assault in the killing camps of the Nazis. They diminished both the respect the victimizers might have for their victims and the respect the victims might have for themselves. It occurred to me that if a power differential is crucial to the idea of cruelty, then when that power differential is maintained, cruelty will tend to be maintained. And when that power differential is eliminated, cruelty will tend to be eliminated. And this seemed to work. In all kinds of cruelty, violent and polite, episodic and institutional, when the victim arms himself with the appropriate strength, the cruelty diminishes or disappears. When Jews joined the bush warriors of France, the Maquis, and became powerful enough to strike at Vichy or the Nazis, they stopped being victims of French and Nazi cruelty. When Frederick Douglass learned to use the language with great skill and expressiveness, and when he learned to use his physical strength against his masters, the power differential between him and his masters diminished, and so did their cruelty to him. In his autobiography, he wrote, "A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity. Human nature is so constituted that it cannot honor a helpless man, though it can pity him. And even this, it cannot do long if signs of power do not arise." When I looked back at my own childhood in Chicago, I remembered that the physical and mental cruelties that I suffered in the slums of the Southwest Side when I was about 10 years old sharply diminished and finally disappeared when I learned how to defend myself physically and verbally. It is exactly this lesson that Douglass learned while growing up in the cruel institution of slavery. Cruelty, then, whatever else it is a kind of power relationship, an imbalance of power wherein the stronger party becomes the victimizer and the weaker becomes the victim. And since many general terms are most swiftly understood in relationship with their opposites, just as heavy can be understood most handily in relationship with what we mean by light, the opposite of cruelty lay in a situation where there is no imbalance of power. The opposite of cruelty, I learned, was freedom from that unbalanced power relationship. Either the victim should get stronger and stand up to the victimizer and thereby bring about a balance of their powers, or the victim should free himself from the whole relationship by flight. In pursuing this line of thought, I came to believe that, again, dictionaries are misleading. Many of them give kindness as the antonym to cruelty. In studying slavery in America and the concentration camps of Central Europe, I found that kindness could be the ultimate cruelty, especially when it was given within that unbalanced power relationship. A kind overseer or a kind camp guard can exacerbate cruelty, can remind his victim that there are other relationships than the relationship of cruelty, and can make the victim deeply bitter, especially when he sees the self-satisfied smile of his victimizer. He is being cruelly treated when he is given a penny or a bun after having endured the crushing and grinding of his mental and bodily well-being. As Frederick Douglass puts it, the kindness of the slave master only gilded the chain. It detracted nothing from its weight or strength. The thought that men are for other and better uses than slavery throve best under the gentle treatment of a kind master. No, I learned, the opposite of cruelty is not kindness. The opposite of the cruelty of the overseer in American slavery was not the kindness of that overseer for a moment or for a day. An episodic kindness is not the opposite of an institutionalized cruelty. The opposite of the institutionalized cruelty is freedom from the cruel relationship. It is important to see how perspectival the whole meaning of cruelty is. From the perspective of the SS Guard or the Southern Overseer, a bit of bread, a smile is indeed a diminution of cruelty. But in the relationship of cruelty, the point of view of the victimizer is of only minor importance. It is the point of view of the victim that is authoritative. The victim feels the suffering in his own mind and body, whereas the victimizer, like Himmler's hard and decent Nazi, can be quite unaware of that suffering. The sword does not feel the pain it inflicts. Do not ask it about suffering. Goodness personified in Le Chambon. All these considerations drove me to write my book, The Paradox of Cruelty. But with the book behind me, I felt a deep discontent. I saw cruelty as an embodiment, a particular case of evil. But if cruelty is one of the main evils of human history, why is the opposite of cruelty not one of the key goods of human history? Freedom from the cruel relationship, either by escaping it or by redressing the imbalance of power, was not essential to what Western philosophers and theologians have thought of as goodness. Escape is a negative affair. Goodness has something positive in it, something triumphantly affirmative. Hoping for a hint of goodness in the very center of evil, I started looking closely at the so-called medical experiments of the Nazis upon children, usually Jewish and Gypsy children. In the death camps, here were the weakest of the weak. Not only were they despised minorities, but they were, as individuals, still in their nonage. They were dependents. Here, the power imbalance between the cruel experimenters and their victims was at its greatest. But instead of seeing light or finding insight by going down into this hell, into the deepest depth of cruelty, I found myself unwillingly becoming part of the world I was studying. I found myself either yearning to be viciously cruel to the victimizers of the children, or I found myself feeling compassion for the children, feeling their despair and pain as they looked up at the men and women in those white coats cutting off their fingertips one at a time, or breaking their slender bones, or wounding their internal organs. Either I became a would-be victimizer, or one more Jewish victim. And in either case, I was not achieving insight, only misery, like so many other students of the Holocaust. And when I was trying to be objective about my studies, when I was succeeding at being indifferent to both the victimizers and the victims of these cruel relationships, I became cold. I became another monster who could look upon the maiming of a child with an indifferent eye. To relieve this unending suffering, from time to time I would turn to the literature of the French resistance to the Nazis. I had been trained by the U.S. Army to understand it. The resistance was a way of trying to redress the power imbalance between Hitler's Fortress Europe and Hitler's victims. And so I saw it as an enemy of cruelty. Still, its methods were often cruel, like the methods of most power struggles, and I had little hope of finding goodness there. We soldiers violated the negative ethic forbidding killing in order, we thought, to follow the positive ethic of being our brother's keepers. And then one gray April afternoon, I found a brief article on the French village of Les Chambon-sur-Lignon. I shall not analyze here the tears of amazement and gladness and release from despair, in short of joy, that I shed when I first read that story. Tears themselves interest me greatly, but not the tears of melancholy, hindsight, and existential despair. Rather, the tears of awe you experience when the realization of an ideal suddenly appears before your very eyes or thunders inside your mind. These tears interest me. And one of the reasons I wept at first reading about Les Chambon in those brief, inaccurate pages was that at last I had discovered an embodiment of goodness in opposition to cruelty. I had discovered in the flesh and blood of history, in people with definite names in a definite place at a definite time in the nightmare of history, what no classical or religious ethicist could deny was goodness. The French Protestant village of Les Chambon, located in the Cevennes mountains of southeastern France, and with a population of about 3,500, saved the lives of about 6,000 people, most of them Jewish children whose parents had been murdered in the killing camps of Central Europe. Under a national government which was not only collaborating with the Nazi conquerors of France, but frequently trying to outdo the Germans in anti-Semitism in order to please their conquerors, and later under the day-to-day threat of destruction by the German armed SS, they started to save children in the winter of 1940, the winter after the fall of France, and they continued to do so until the war in France was over. They sheltered the refugees in their own homes and in various houses they established especially for them. And they took many of them across the terrible mountains to neutral Geneva, Switzerland, in the teeth of French and German police and military power. The people of Les Chambon are poor, and the Huguenot faith to which they belong is a diminishing faith in Catholic and atheist France. But their spiritual power, the capacity to act in unison against the victimizers who surrounded them, was immense, and more than a match for the military power of those victimizers. But for me, as an ethicist, the heart of the matter was not only their special power. What interested me was that they obeyed both the negative and the positive injunctions of ethics. They were good not only in the sense of trying to be their brother's keepers, protecting the victim, defending the fatherless, to use the language of Isaiah. They were also good in the sense that they obeyed the negative injunctions against killing and betraying, while those around them, including myself, were murdering in order, presumably, to help mankind in some way or other. They murdered nobody and betrayed not a single child in those long and dangerous 4 years. For me as an ethicist, they were the embodiment of unambiguous goodness. But for me as a student of cruelty, they were something more. They were an embodiment of the opposite of cruelty. And so, somehow, at last, I had found goodness in opposition to cruelty. In studying their story, and in telling it in Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, I learned that the opposite of cruelty is not simply freedom from the cruel relationship, it is hospitality. It lies not only in something negative, in absence of cruelty or of imbalance, it lies in unsentimental, efficacious love. The opposite of the cruelties of the camp was not the liberation of the camps, the cleaning out of the barracks and the cessation of the horrors. All of this was the end of the cruelty relationship, not the opposite of that relationship. And it was not even the end of it, because the victims would never forget and would remain in agony as long as they remembered their humiliation and suffering. No, the opposite of cruelty was not the liberation of the camps, not freedom. It was the hospitality of the people of Chambon and of very few others during the Holocaust. The opposite of cruelty was the kind of goodness that happened in Chambon. Let me explain the difference between liberation and hospitality by telling you about a letter I received a year ago from a woman who had been saved by the people of Les Chambon when she was a young girl. She wrote, "Never was there a question that the Chambonese would not share all they had with us, meager as it was. One Chambonese once told me that even if there was less, they still would want more for us." And she goes on, "It was indeed a very different attitude from the one in Switzerland, which while saving us also resented us so much. If today we are not bitter people like most survivors, it can only be due to the fact that we met people like the people of Les Chambon, who showed to us simply that life can be different, that there are people who care, that people can live together, and even risk their own lives for their fellow man." The Swiss liberated refugees and removed them from the cruel relationship. The people of Les Chambon did more. They taught them that goodness could conquer cruelty, that loving hospitality could remove them from the cruel relationship. And they taught me this, too. It is important to emphasize that cruelty is not simply an episodic, momentary manner, especially institutional cruelty like that of Nazism or slavery. As we have seen throughout this essay, not only does it persist while it is being exerted upon the weak, it can persist in the survivors after they have escaped the power relationship. The survivors torture themselves, continue to suffer, continue to maim their own lives long after the actual torture is finished. The self-hatred and rage of the blacks and the despair of the Native Americans and the Jews who have suffered under institutional crushing and maiming are continuations of original cruelties. And these continuations exist because only a superficial liberation from torture has occurred. The sword has stopped falling on their flesh in the old obvious ways, but the wounds still bleed. I am not saying that the village of Chambon healed these wounds. They go too deep. What I am saying is that the people I have talked to who were once children in Les Chambon have more hope for their species and more respect for themselves as human beings than most other survivors I have met. The enduring hospitality they met in Les Chambon helped them find realistic hope in a world of persisting cruelty. What was the nature of this hospitality that saved and deeply changed so many lives? It is hard to summarize briefly what the Chambonese did, and above all, how they did it. The morning after a new refugee family came to town, they would find on their front door a wreath that said, "Bienvenue," welcome, painted on a piece of cardboard attached to the wreath. Nobody knew who had brought the wreath. In effect, the whole town had brought it. It was mainly the women of Chambon who gave so much more than shelter to these, the most hated enemies of the Nazis. There was Madame Barraud, a tiny Alsatian, who cared for the refugee boys in her house with all the love such a tiny body could hold, and who cared for the way they felt day and night. And there were others. But there was one person without whom Les Chambon could not have become the safest place in Europe for Jews. The Huguenot minister of the village, André Trocmé. Trocmé was a passionately religious man. He was massive, more than 6 feet tall, blonde, with a quick temper. Once, long after the war, while he was lecturing on the main project of his life, the promotion of the idea of nonviolence in international relations, one of the members of his audience started to whisper a few words to his neighbor. Trocmé let this go on for a few moments, then interrupted his speech, walked up to the astonished whisperer, raised his massive arm, pointed toward the door, and yelled, "Out, out, get out!" And the lecture was on nonviolence. The center of his thought was the belief that God showed how important man was by becoming himself a human being, and by becoming a particular sort of human being who was the embodiment of sacrificially generous love. For Trocmé, every human being was like Jesus, had God in him or her, and was just as precious as God himself. And when Trocmé, with the help of the Quakers and others, organized his village into the most efficient rescue machine in Europe, he did so not only to save the Jews, but also to save the Nazis and the collaborators. He wanted to keep them from blackening their souls with more evil. He wanted to save them, the victimizers, from evil. One of the reasons he was successful was that the Huguenots had been themselves persecuted for hundreds of years by the kings of France, and they knew what persecution was. In fact, when the people of Chambon took Jewish children and their whole families across the mountains of southeastern France into neutral Switzerland, they often followed pathways that had been taken by Huguenots in their flight from the dragoons of the French king. A particular incident from the story of Les Chambon during the Nazi occupation of France will explain succinctly why he was successful in making the village a village of refuge. But before I relate the story, I must point out that the people of the village did not think of themselves as successful, let alone good. From their point of view, they did not do anything that required elaborate explanation. When I asked them why they helped these dangerous guests, they invariably answered, "What do you mean, why? Where else could they go? How could you turn them away? What is so special about being ready to help, prêt à servir? There was nothing else to do." And some of them laughed in amazement when I told them that I thought they were good people. They saw no alternative to their actions and to the way they acted, and therefore they saw what they did as necessary, not something to be picked out for praise. Helping these guests was for them as natural as breathing or eating. One does not think of alternatives to these functions. They did not think of alternatives to sheltering people who were endangering not only the lives of their hosts, but the lives of all the people in the village. And now the story. One afternoon, a refugee woman knocked on the door of a farmhouse outside the village. The farmers around the village proper were Protestants, like most of others in Chambon, but with one difference. They were mostly Darbists, followers of a strange Scot named Darby, who taught their ancestors in the 19th century to believe every word of the Bible, and indeed, who had them memorize the Bible. They were literal fundamentalists. The farm woman opened the door to the refugee and invited her into the kitchen where it was warm. Standing in the middle of the floor, the refugee, in heavily accented French, asked for eggs for her children. In those days of very short supplies, people with children often went to farmers in the gray market, neither black nor exactly legal, to get necessary food. This was early in 1941, and the farmers were not yet accustomed to the refugees. The farmer woman looked into the eyes of the shawled refugee and asked, "Are you Jewish?" The woman started to tremble, but she could not lie. Even though that question was usually the beginning of the end of life for Jews in Hitler's fortress Europe, she answered, "Yes." The woman ran from the kitchen to the staircase nearby, and while the refugee trembled with terror in the kitchen, she called up the stairs, "Husband, children, come down, come down. We have in our house at this very moment a representative of the chosen people." Not all the Protestants in Chambon were Darbist fundamentalists, but almost all were convinced that people are the children of God and are as precious as God himself. Their leaders were Huguenot preachers, and their followings of the negative and positive commandments of the Bible came in part from their personal generosity and courage, but also in part from the depths of their religious conviction that we are all children of God, and we must take care of each other lovingly. This, combined with the ancient and deep historical ties between the Huguenots and the Jews of France and their own centuries of persecution by the dragoons and kings of France, helped make them what they were, always ready to help, as the Chamonix saying goes. A choice of perspectives. We have come a long way from cruelty to the people of Chambon, just as I have come a long way in my research from concrete evil to concrete goodness. Let me conclude with a point that has been alternately hinted at and stressed in the course of this essay. A few months after Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed was published, I received a letter from Massachusetts that opened as follows. I have read your book, and I believe that you mushy-minded moralists should be awakened to the facts. Nothing happened in Les Chambon. Nothing of any importance whatsoever. The Holocaust, dear Professor, was like a geological event, like an earthquake. No person could start it, no person could change it, and no person could end it. And no small group of persons could do so either. It was the armies and the nations that performed actions that counted. Individuals did nothing. You sentimentalists have got to learn that the great masses and the big political ideas make the difference. Your people and the people they saved simply do not exist. Now, between this position and mine, there is an abyss that no amount of shouted arguments or facts can cross. And so I shall not answer this letter with a tightly organized reply. I shall answer it only by telling you that one of the reasons institutional cruelty exists and persists is that people believe that individuals can do nothing, that only vast ideologies and armies can act meaningfully. Every act of institutional cruelty, Nazism, slavery, and all the others, lives not with people in the concrete, but with abstractions that blind people to individuals. Himmler's speech to the SS leadership in 1943 is full of phrases like exterminating a bacillus and the Jewish people will be exterminated. And in that speech, he attacks any German who believes he's decent Jew. Institutional cruelty, like other misleading approaches to ethics, blinds us to the victim's point of view. And when we are blind to that point of view, we can countenance and perpetrate cruelty with impunity. I have told you that I cannot and will not try to refute the letter from Massachusetts. I shall only summarize the point of view of this essay with another story. The Holocaust was storm, lightning, thunder, wind, rain. And Les Chambon was the rainbow. I was lecturing a few months ago in Minneapolis, and when I finished talking about the Holocaust in the village of Les Chambon, a woman stood up and asked me if the village of Les Chambon was in the department of Haute-Loire, the high sources of the Loire River. Obviously, she was French with her accent, and all French people know that there are many villages called Les Chambon in France, just as any American knows that there are many main streets in the United States. I said that Les Chambon was indeed in the Haute-Loire. She said, "Then you have been speaking about the village that saved all three of my children. I want to thank you for writing this book, not only because the story will now be permanent, but also because I shall be able to talk about those terrible days with Americans now, for they will understand those days better than they have. You see, you Americans, though you sometimes cross the oceans, live on an island here as far as war is concerned." Then she asked to come up and say one sentence. There was not a sound, not even breathing, to be heard in the room. She came to the front of the room and said, "The Holocaust was storm, lightning, thunder, wind, rain, yes. And Les Chambon was the rainbow." Only from her perspective can you understand the cruelty and the goodness I have been talking about, not from the point of view of the gentleman from Massachusetts. You must choose which perspective is best, and your choice will have much to do with your feelings about the preciousness of life, and not only the preciousness of other people's lives. If the lives of others are precious to you, your life will become more precious to you. Thank you. You have been listening to From Cruelty to Goodness by Philip Hallie, as it was published in June 1981 in the Hastings Center Report, Volume 11, Number 3. Hopefully you can stomach my mispronunciation of these different locations, names, and ideologies and get to the main point that Mr. Hallie was trying to get to. I hope you enjoyed this audio reading and you'll come back, re-listen, and learn as much as you possibly can.